26th. And because it's Friday around here at Vote Common Good Daily Podcast live stream, we like to say it's Science and Economics Day here. And we're going to be talking about economics today with Fadhel Kaboub, who's becoming, I don't know, Fadhel, if we can say this about you officially, but like our the economist of the Vote Common Good ideas. So we're excited for this conversation today. Robb has also joined us. I'm standing up in Minneapolis in the basement studio. We'd love to know on the live stream where it is that you're coming from. And on this podcast, we like to hear from you, and we also like to share with you some perspectives that we think will help you open your eyes to what's happening in the world, so we can see those things, we can engage in them, and we can find our pathway forward. And so trying to build a common good ethos for all of us, but especially for faith voters, about how we think about the issues that matter to us. And boy, there's almost nothing more important to the political sphere and to our economic and to our civic life than our economics. And well, Professor Fadhel, I mean, I know that you teach this at Denison University, so to you, economics makes sense. But boy, to the rest of us, we need a little help. We need a little help. Well, so let us know in the chat rooms where you're coming from. Tell us your city. Tell us what you're doing, and how you're thinking about this. And stick with us throughout the next 45 minutes as we're together. So I already mentioned that we have Professor Fadhel Kaboub with us and Robb. Hey, Robb. Good morning.
Hey, Doug. How are you this morning?
I'm hanging in there. Thank you. Doing quite well.
Yeah.
Doing quite well.
Awesome.
Some people they get excited by Fridays. I get excited by Fridays, not because it's the end of the work week, but because we get to talk about science and economics here.
Exactly. And I'm a regular on the Tuesday show, not on the Friday show. On Tuesday when we talk about politics, but Fadhel's a friend of mine, and so I kind of elbowed my way in on this just because I love to be in conversation with Fadhel about how all this stuff works. Because it makes such a difference. And I think so many of us, we apply kind of like what we know about how to balance our own checkbook, if that's still a thing people do. And it's just a completely different ballgame when we're talking about economics on the national or global scale.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys for having me on the show again. And Robb, it's, you can't really do economics without politics, and you can't do politics without economics. I mean, there's all political economy. We're all living in this, giant mess that intersects with all of these issues. And you can't talk about economics and politics without social justice issues, without talking about the resources that we use to produce stuff, which means the nature that we live in and breathe and use its resources. So we can't really do any of this without being mindful of the intersections. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we're intersecting, your Tuesday with your Friday today.
Well played, my friend. Hey, I've had two friends, both named John. One spells it with an H, one without. I've talked to both of them about the ideas that we've raised here about what's sometimes referred to as modern monetary theory. But the perspective that you shared with us the last time you're on, I think we'll get into today, that there's a way of thinking about how we do monetary policy through our federal government. And one of them his mind was blown, and he hits me up regularly now with these random questions. Like he'll be driving in his truck and say, hey, if the government can just keep spending money because it produces the money, then why do we sell bonds and why do we have debt to China? Kind of questions. The other John says, oh, I think you're into that MMT stuff, that modern monetary theory. And he's a Marxist. And he says, that's not going to get us anywhere. That doesn't make any sense. We have to shift the economy to the fact that individuals need to be able to have ownership of every company. And that's the only solution. And modern monetary theory is trying to give an escape hatch so that we don't do the important things that we have to do. And so it was interesting that one of them, is coming at this from a much more conservative side and says, I don't think it can work. The other one comes at it from a liberal Marxist side, and he says there's no way that it can work, which tells me we're on to something around here with what
that's the perfect balance. Exactly. Actually, to your point, on MMT and the perception, kind of the popular perception of it, you're right. The left has its own critique of it. The right has its own critique of it. And in the U.S. Congress, yesterday, I believe, a representative from the state of Oklahoma introduced a resolution to condemn MMT as dangerous for the country, because it introduces all this irresponsible spending that will cause hyperinflation and bankrupt the country. And this is a resolution to match the Senate resolution from a year and a half ago, I believe, introduced by 5 U.S. senators, also condemning MMT as dangerous for the country. So this is where we are today. And it's in response to the CARES Act, followed by the 1.9 trillion from a couple of weeks ago, followed hopefully by the $3 trillion infrastructure proposal that President Biden and the Democrats will be bringing over the next few weeks, few months. And MMT is essentially saying, we can afford this. We can probably afford way more than the $3 trillion if we do the right things, because it's not just spend and do nothing else. And there's all kinds of taxing and regulation and spending strategically in key areas that allows us to thrive as an economy, as a society. But the standard economics perspective says if the government spends beyond its tax revenues, beyond its limited kind of borrowing capacity, we're going to bankrupt the country. We're going to cause hyperinflation. And those are, I'm not talking about kind of right-wing extremist views. I'm talking about, traditional liberal economists like Larry Summers, right? Who's, he's not the conservative economist most people perceive. And he's saying this is going to overheat the economy. And that's really where it gets to economic theory, the dominant view, the Larry Summers views of economists who dominate the, policy circles. They live in a universe where they think of the government as more or less similar to a household. So you and I, responsible people, what did our parents teach us? They taught us to be responsible with your money, not to overspend, especially during bad economic times. So what you and I should be doing is be more careful with our budget. And then they take that logic from an individual level and say, well, the government should be just as responsible and not overspend. Well, sure, responsible people borrow a little bit of money, right? To buy a car, to buy a house, with every now and then, but we borrow within reasonable limits, right? And the bank will not let you borrow unlimited amounts. And once you borrow, you have a debt. So you and I have to work hard to pay it off. We spend less in the future. We get a second job or some other source of revenue so that we can pay our debts. And they take that logic and they say the federal government should do the same. It's okay to borrow a little bit during a bad economic times to get through the crisis. So Larry Summers and kind of mainstream economists will tell us, sure, a little bit of borrowing is fine. And they justify it by saying, well, the interest rate is so low. This is a good opportunity to borrow now. But as soon as the interest rate goes up, that's it. And as soon as we do a little bit of the spending, like the CARES Act, like the 1.9 trillion, say beyond that, we're really going into dangerous territory, right? And we're going to bankrupt the country. And we're going to cause inflation and so on. So I'm happy to explain the MMT perspectives in terms of what actually causes inflation, because all of these economists who have been warning about inflation for the last 10 years, they've been wrong about inflation. They've been wrong about interest rates. They've been wrong about inequality. They've been wrong about climate change. And yet somehow we still see them on Bloomberg every day.
Okay, so Barbara is on the chat, and Barbara, I think, is expressing something that many people express. Her opening comment was, I'm hoping you know that American taxpayers are going to pay for all of this BS, right? So is that how it works when the federal government invests $1.9 trillion in the American Rescue Plan or $3 trillion in infrastructure? Is it just now there's a big tally and sometimes somebody's going to have to go and send a tax bill to all the American citizens to pay for that? Is that how it actually works when the government says we're going to spend X amount of dollars?
That's how it works at the state and municipal level. You and I, taxpayers, pay for the spending that the state does, the municipality, the school district. And we pay for it either by paying more taxes, or sometimes the state or the municipality will issue municipal bonds and borrow, but that borrowing is eventually paid for with local residents in the state paying higher taxes in the future. That is absolutely correct. because states are like you and I. They're users of the US dollar. They can't create it into existence. The federal government has the authority by the Constitution, the power of the purse, to spend money into existence. And that's a very serious responsibility. It doesn't mean we should spend unlimited amounts. That's certainly not what MMT is saying. MMT is reminding us we have the power of the purse through the democratic process. The 535 people we elect can actually spend money into existence. And the spending limit that we should always be mindful of is not constrained by how much we can gather in taxes or how much we can borrow from Wall Street or from anybody else. The spending limit is the risk of inflation. And the risk of inflation, according to MMT, is determined by two things, very important things for us to be mindful of that actually allow us to get out of this crisis. The limits to how much we can spend has to do with the availability of productive capacity. In other words, if we have the technology, the skilled people, the materials to produce more, and we decide to spend more, that spending will not be inflationary. That spending will actually be allowing us to use those otherwise unused resources, unemployed resources, including unemployed people, to create more economic activity. So as long as that is the case, there will be no risk of inflation. The good news about productive capacity is that it's also producible. We can produce more of it. We can train more doctors and nurses and care workers and so on. So it allows us that additional boost to the economy.
Yeah.
Rob, you have a question.
Yeah. So Fadhel, a lot of us kind of grew up, with that adage of, money doesn't grow on trees.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think this mindset that tax revenue pays for social programs, pays for, everything that the federal government does.
Sure.
Comes from this idea that money doesn't grow on trees, that there's a finite amount of money that needs to be moved around and redistributed. And
right. That was the case when we had the gold. That was the case when we had a gold standard, where we physically had a limited quantity of gold, and paper money was essentially a representation of that gold that was held in reserves. Yeah. And we couldn't print more money than the quantity of gold that we had. Otherwise, we devalue that paper money and we cause inflation. We don't live in a gold standard anymore because we discovered eventually that globally, there's a limited quantity of gold. So we couldn't grow the global economy. And that led to a lot of, because all countries were chasing gold everywhere. And that was part of colonialism, is to, if you can't dig for gold, you can go take it from another country, either through trade or through colonial. You go dig their mines and take their gold. Yeah. So we don't have that system anymore. Our monetary system is it's called fiat money, which means money is simply that worthless piece of paper that has cotton in it, basically. It's not worth $100. It's worth whatever the government says it's worth. The government puts $100 on it, that symbolizes $100. So we're gone from that system. But we're not saying that now that we don't have gold reserves required to issue currency, that we should print unlimited amounts of money, right? Yeah. So the constraint is productive capacity. The second source of the risk of inflation, which is extremely important, I think, for us to tackle here, and I think all of us will agree that this is a major issue, is what I call the abusive price-setting behavior of key players in the economy. That is, key corporations, key entities in the market who can actually raise prices because they can, because they have too much market power. Think of big tech, think of big pharma, think of all the major players in the economy who have a very high degree of market concentration. And as a result, that kind of inflation risk is not going to go away by saying we shouldn't spend more or we should spend less or whatever. That risk of inflation only goes away if we tax and regulate it out of existence. In other words, if we use antitrust laws, the laws of the land, to actually make the market more competitive and fair for consumers and for other businesses. In other words, if we democratize those industries, and whose responsibility is to tax and regulate and enforce antitrust laws, it's the U.S. Congress. the lawmakers, the 535 people we elect in this democracy. The problem that we have, and I'll close with this so we can discuss it a bit more, is that the 535 people, quite a few of them, are brought to you with their sponsors on their, race car jackets, the super PACs from those same markets that we're trying to regulate. So we don't actually have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it was supposed to be. We have a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And that market concentration is really what suffocates the spending capacity of the federal government. So the more we democratize it, the more we increase the potential spending capacity before we hit the risk of inflation. Yeah. So that's really the MMT lens is telling us what the real possibilities are and what the real constraints are.
Can you give us an example of one of those corporations that has that kind of outstripped influence that you think, hey, there could be some regulation here that could make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. We're all connected on the internet right now, including the viewers and so on. Who's providing your internet service, right? Your broadband company or DSL company, whatever service you use. What if you don't? I'm assuming, at least I don't like the service that they're providing, and the fact that I don't like it forced me to go look for other options. They send me a bill every month, and the bill keeps getting more expensive and bigger, and there's all these fees, all these charges. And I say, wait a minute, why am I paying 50% more in just 1 year for the same crappy service, right? And I call and complain and say, well, yeah, we'll sell the technician, we'll move the router from here to there. Nothing, it's the same crappy service. So then I say, okay, I don't like it, I'm gonna cancel, I'm gonna move to another company. There's no other service. They're all selling the same service. And they all have no incentive to compete, no incentive to, they compete on the margin. So they say, oh, we'll give you a discount for the first 3 months to steal you from the other company, but we're selling pretty much the same service, right? And this is true across the country. So telecom, for example, the market power that Google has, that Apple has, the market power that your oil companies have in the US, real estate developers and real estate companies in key markets in New York and San Francisco and so on. So you have no alternative, right? If you're going to rent in New York City, you're going to rent in New York City, right? So these are the examples. Pharmaceuticals, we've seen it over the last few years and increasingly more. They raise the price of insulin because they can. Not because we don't know the formula for producing insulin or because we've known the chemical formula for decades. It's cheap to produce in almost every other country. And yet here, because they can raise prices, they do, right? And they can exclude people from services. They can raise prices and there's nothing you can do. Why? Because the regulators let them have it. And that's not how a democracy should function. That's not how our democracy was supposed to function. So we're talking about if we tax and regulate these key industries and regulate their market, abusive power out of existence, we have a more democratic, more competitive market, which allows prices not to be abused in this way. And that removes the risk of inflation. And which means it gives us additional spending capacity at the national level without causing inflation. So the metaphor that I used last time, I think, is something that a lot of people can connect to. It's like having, access in your backyard to the biggest freshwater lake in the country. And you can use it to drink fresh water, you can use it to water your farm, and do the right thing. But somehow we decide that we shouldn't waste that lake water, so we should drink half a cup a day and get dehydrated. And we shouldn't use all of that water or some of that water to water your trees to grow fruits or corn or whatever you're watering. So what we're saying, we're not saying use the entire lake to flood your farm or use the entire lake to drink every day. That will be too much, right? You'll flood the whole system. We're saying use whatever you need so that your trees and plants are thriving and not drying, so that you're not dehydrated, so you drink the appropriate amount of water you need for yourself, for your family, and so on. And not beyond that. You have the whole lake, but use whatever you need of it. So the government has access to that large lake of money, right? And we're artificially forcing ourselves to say, oh, we shouldn't use it. Well, so let the economy starve, and we dehydrate the system, and we create unemployment and inequality and social justice issues and so on.
So Fadhel, I just want to re-articulate, because for people who are hearing this for the first time, it's a little shocking that they hear at the federal level, federal government, separate from your state governments, municipal governments, the federal level, taxes are not used to fund the treasury. That taxes are used to control inflation and to make certain behaviors more acceptable and other behaviors less acceptable. Those are the two reasons that the federal government utilizes taxes. When people hear that when the federal government spends money from the federal budget, it's not being replenished by taxes, that takes a moment for that to settle in for someone, right? Because they're still pretty sure that there's a bank account, and the bank account gets all your money that you send for your taxes goes in the bank account, and then they write checks to spend it out. And if it gets below zero, then they have to go to China to borrow. And you're saying, no, that's not how it works. Mm-hmm. So tell us, why do we keep track of deficits, federal deficits, and why does the federal government sell bonds as a way to fund its own expenditures if the federal government doesn't have a bank account that gets money going in and money going out? Why is that a piece of the equation? Not just how do people misspeak about, these things, but what's the function then of managing deficits, paying attention to them, and selling bonds?
Very good question. So let me use the best example in U.S. history to illustrate how this goes. So World War II, very expensive spending program, right? And it came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in U.S. history. There was no money to be taxed. There was no money to be borrowed. Very clear. I don't think we can argue about that. And then we go from that to this massive spending program. And the debate at the time was not where are we going to find the money, like from which bank account, who are we going to tax, who are we going to borrow from? There's no money to be borrowed locally in the U.S. or internationally because there was a global Great Depression, right? So how did we pay for World War II? We used the power of the purse, the capacity of the federal government to spend money into existence, and hired tons and tons of people across the country. We moved the unemployment rate at the time from right before the war, I think it was something like 17 or 16%, to pretty much zero. We actually had to bring women into the labor force, older people back into the labor force, younger people into the labor force, and work third shift to keep up with the war effort. So massive shift, all of it paid for by government spending money into existence. So we knew how to do this, and we know how to do this all the time. We just sometimes pretend not to know how to do it. The concern and the biggest risk during that transition from the Great Depression to World War II was, what are those workers going to do with their income, right? The risk of inflation, in other words. It's a free country, right? They would have gone out on a shopping spree to buy a new house, to go out and entertainment and buy a new car, whatever it is, right? People are free to do whatever they want with their money. And that would have caused inflation. Why? Because we literally didn't have any spare productive capacity to produce new homes. We didn't have construction workers available. We didn't have construction materials available because we were using all of it for war purposes. And we didn't have any capacity to produce new cars because the entire manufacturing industry was retooled to produce tanks and airplanes and so on. So had those workers gone out to buy new cars and new homes that they deserved, right, because it's their money, we would have seen inflation in the US, hyperinflation potentially. So what did we do after we started the war, after we hired those workers to do this? We started selling freedom bonds or war bonds. Not before the war. The war was already funded. It was already paid for. It was after the fact to entice those workers to do the following. Please postpone your spending until after the war. Give us $10,000. We'll give you this piece of paper that says U.S. government bond, and we promise to pay you back plus interest. It's due in 10 years and 15 years and 30 years. whatever those savings war bonds were. It was to entice workers to save rather than consume. Please abstain from consumption until after the war. Why after the war? Because after the war, we have Detroit back to producing cars. We have construction workers back from the war to build new homes. And that was the post-war boom. And we had other strategies to manage inflation too. But this was a key component of it. So the war bonds were not there to fund the war. The government didn't need to borrow its own money from people to pay for the war. The government already paid for the war. But the government needed people not to consume, not to cause inflation. And this is how the government functions all the time. The CARES Act. We didn't tax anybody. We didn't borrow from anybody. If anything, we lowered taxes right before the CARES Act, right, on corporations and so on. And yet, the entire U.S. Congress, all senators voted in favor of the CARES Act. Money was created into existence. I think there were maybe 4 senators missing from the vote because of COVID exposure or something like that. But it was not the issue. Finding the money is never the issue, as long as we set it as a national priority. It was about how do we manage the risk of inflation. And in the U.S., currently, COVID situation and the CARES Act, the 1.9 trillion, the 3 trillion infrastructure spending that will be forthcoming soon, we have plenty of unused productive capacity. Lots of people unemployed. Lots of people want to re-enter into the labor force. And we have plenty of technology and know-how and technical capabilities to build the infrastructure that we need, that we deserve. So the risk of inflation is not even close, right?
Got it.
And
So
I'll give you one final counterexample.
Yeah, you do that, and then I have a follow-up question about current bonds, but go ahead.
The country that's been doing this for decades, literally for decades, Japan, has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world. I think it's 260% right now. Massive national debt, massive deficits for literally 3 decades. And what does the mainstream of the economics profession tell us should have happened to Japan? Hyperinflation, high interest rates, bankruptcy, government default, right? None of this happened. Japan today, for 3 decades, is suffering from deflation, not inflation. Japan has negative interest rates, not extremely high interest rates. Japan's government never defaulted on its debt, right? So all the views of the mainstream perspective are coming from that individual responsible behavior. Money doesn't grow on trees. Your parents taught you right, be responsible. But at the national government, when you have a sovereign government like Japan, like the US, where the entire debt stock, all the government bonds issued, are denominated in the national currency. So a government that has debt denominated in foreign currencies, like Greece, like Spain, like Venezuela, like Zimbabwe, that's separate, because those governments now are users of a foreign currency, like you and I are users of the dollar. So they need to be fiscally responsible, like you and I are responsible, like my state and my county treasurers are responsible. But the federal government is a sovereign issuer of the currency, like Japan, like the UK, like Canada, which means all of those governments have this additional untapped potential spending capacity that they're not necessarily tapping into. They could be tapping into to get things done way before we get to the risk of inflation that I talked about.
So why do we currently sell bonds, and why does China buy all this U.S. bonds, and then people use the phrase, the U.S. is in debt to China? We've borrowed from China to pay for our fill in the blank. Why how is that? Why is it explained like that? And if that's not what's happening, what is happening, and why are we still selling bonds to Chinese government and to other people that buy it?
Very good question. Well, if we really were borrowing money from China, then what we should do, the responsible thing to do in Congress in the next few weeks, before we even decide on this infrastructure plan, is to have a formal meeting with the Chinese Communist Party and say, are you guys in favor of us building infrastructure? Will you fund this infrastructure for us for the next 10 years? That will be the logical thing to do. Yeah. None of this is happening, right? We are a sovereign nation. We decide what we need here. We create money to do it. And then when we spend that money and we pay millions of workers to build a new infrastructure and to improve our quality of life, what we are concerned with is, what will they do with that spending? Will they spend it and hyperinflate the economy? Do we have additional capacity for them to buy new homes, to have more entertainment, to buy more textiles, or whatever they want to buy, right? Consumers buy whatever they want. That's the concern that we should be having now. So as part of that exercise, the federal government and the Treasury sells bonds to investors who want to save in the safest asset in the world, which is AAA rated US government bonds. And when the Treasury auctions those bonds, it's literally giving the rest of us, people who save, individuals, businesses, financial institutions, but also foreign governments, the opportunity to open a savings account, literally a savings account at the Treasury that says, here's my deposit, I'll come back to pick it up in 30 years and I'll collect my interest payment. Now, if you are China or Japan or any major exporter in the world, which China is the second largest economy in the world, you earn a lot of export revenues in US dollars because that's the dominant currency. So now you're China, you have trillions of dollars worth of revenues. Where would you save your money? Under the mattress? Obviously not. You have US dollars. What's the safest savings account in US dollars on the planet? It's the Treasury. US Treasury has those government bonds. So it's totally logical for China to park its savings in the safest place on the planet, which is US Treasury bonds. We are not borrowing from China. We're giving China an opportunity to park its savings somewhere safe, right? Now, they could take their savings and they decide, you know what? The US is not safe. We don't think the US is responsible or whatever it is, or we don't like the US. We're going to take our dollars, change them into euros, and save them in some European banks, right? That's totally possible.
So why do we want to help? I understand why in the War of Freedom bonds, we wanted people not to overspend because they were going to buy a house and there weren't enough houses and there goes inflation. But why do we keep doing bonds if that's not what we're doing? And why do we want China to have a great savings plan? I mean, so getting beyond just sort of to put a point in the fact that what you're saying is when someone says, how much do we owe China? You're saying we don't owe China. That's not how you talk about it. It'd be like saying to to a bank, well, how in debt are you by how much savings people have in your bank in your banks that's not how you would determine debt. So getting mentally over that. Why do we keep pitching bonds? And so, like, I got a bunch of bonds, for our kids from grandparents and stuff, and I understand why they did it. But why do we keep wanting to push these bonds if it's not to control inflation in the U.S.? Why are we helping China or any other sovereign nations?
So the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. government doesn't do it for the sake of China. China just happens to be one of the buyers like everybody else in a free market, in a free system, right? The primary goal is to manage the U.S. economy here internally, especially the banking system. So one of the key stabilizing policies that the Federal Reserve uses on a day-to-day basis is a policy to stabilize short-term interest rates. And if short-term interest rates skyrocket by accident because somebody at the Fed fell asleep at the desk a particular day, if interest rates go up dramatically, bond prices in the US will crash and will cause a ripple effect in financial markets. And so take this as a basic formula. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. It's just the way we calculate bond prices in the US, and I mean globally. So what happens if the Fed doesn't have this key policy tool to stabilize the interest rate? And that key policy tool, I'll explain in a second, which is buying and selling US Treasury bonds. If the bond market crashes, the bond market, US Treasury bonds, are the benchmark. It's the risk-free asset that everybody on Wall Street in any financial market uses as what we call the risk-free asset. It's the benchmark based upon which we price everything else in the private sector, because that's considered the benchmark risk-free. It never defaults, because a corporation can default. A corporation can go bankrupt. So we always price according to that baseline. So if that baseline crashes all of a sudden, all the other prices in the market will have to adjust, and you have a financial market crash. And we have instability, we have a crisis. So the job of the Fed is to keep those interest rates stable at the desired target so that the bond market's stable, so that financial markets are stable. Without it, we'll have a disaster. So how does the Fed meet that target on a day-to-day basis? So they target this key interest rate. It's called the Fed funds rate. It's the interest rate that banks, private banks in the US, charge each other when they borrow and lend to each other. So banks go into that Fed funds market. Some will be lending to other banks, some will be borrowing, depending on their needs. And if we starve the market of liquidity, we're going to end up with all banks going to the Fed funds market trying to borrow, right? And if the Federal Reserve Bank doesn't inject additional liquidity, that market will be dry and the price will skyrocket. And if it skyrockets, you have a bond market crash, you have instability. So what does the Federal Reserve Bank do on a day-to-day basis? They watch that interest rate like a hawk. And if they notice it's slightly going up, then they know the market needs a little bit more liquidity. So how does the Fed do it? The Fed goes into the bond market and decides, well, we, the Federal Reserve Bank, are going to buy $100 billion worth of bonds. So we're going to take those bonds out of the system, and we're going to put liquidity into the banking system. Because when we pay somebody, the money goes into a bank account. And that money ripples through the financial system. So now we have more liquidity. And vice versa. If the Fed notices that that interest rate is dropping slightly below the target, well, the Fed knows that there's too much money in the system. So we need to go in immediately and sell US government bonds to somebody out there. It doesn't matter who it is. And then we're pulling money out of the system. And they do it back and forth until they stabilize the interest rate at the desired target. The policy tool that the Fed uses, US Treasury bonds. That's the key policy tool that we do that. That's the risk-free asset. It stabilizes the market. And don't take it from me. Alan Greenspan was asked about this before Congress at the time during the Clinton administration, when people were talking about we should be paying off the national debt, we should get rid of the federal government, shouldn't be borrowing as much, and so on. He literally said this, and you can find the quote on YouTube. He said, if you pay off the national debt and take away those government bonds, you might as well shut down the Fed. In other words, we'll have no policy tool to do what you ask us to do, which is to stabilize the system, right? So we need government bonds, not because the government needs to borrow money from us. The government has its own way to create its own money. But we're providing these tools to the Federal Reserve Bank, to the financial system, to create a smooth functioning, stable economy, to allow us to target interest rates, to stabilize inflation, and so on. But we don't need, the federal government doesn't need to borrow its own money. Your state, your municipality needs to borrow money. You and I need to borrow money to buy a house or start a business or something.
Yeah. So Fadhel, thank you for explaining bonds to us. It's so tremendously helpful. So I guess like one of my follow-up questions would be, okay, so now we understand why the federal government, issues bonds. Why, if the federal government can just, manufacture whatever money is needed for whatever programs, and it's not based on tax revenue, why then does the federal government collect tax revenue? What's the purpose of it? And kind of a secondary question to that is, shouldn't conservatives who are against, tend to be against taxes, shouldn't they just totally love this MMT idea? Shouldn't they embrace this because it's the path to reduce taxes?
Right. And this is really some of my friends on the left, when they hear this, they say, but don't tell them that they can do this because they'll cut taxes even more and they'll start another war. And you shouldn't really be promoting this. And I'm like, they already do this. They already cut the taxes. They already start whichever war they want. If anything, we should expose this so that we know that we have the capacity to set the priorities straight, right? So we should cut taxes for lower income individuals, and it's not going to bankrupt the country. We can afford, better housing, better infrastructure, and it's not going to bankrupt the country. And if we want to end wars for ethical, moral, geopolitical reasons, then we should have an open debate about that. So we shouldn't end war because we can't afford them. We should end wars because we shouldn't have a war, right? So let's have open discussions about these things so that we know what we can afford, what we can't afford, and for what reason. So to answer your question about why the federal government taxes the population, I'm going to take you to the origins of how we discovered these things. And the best examples are colonial examples. like British colonial, French colonial presence in Africa and other parts of the world. The first thing that a colonial authority does when they move into new territory is to impose a tax on the local population. Now, the local population has its own economy, its own money, its own functioning, but the British authority will come in and say, well, we don't really care for your economy, for your system. We are imposing a tax for every head of household in this community. And you have to pay the tax in British pounds that you do not have, that you must earn somehow. And you say, well, wait a minute, we don't care for your taxes. You know, what are you going to do? Oh, well, we're going to take your land, take your property, put you in prison, enslave you if you don't pay the tax. Say, okay, so how do I get rid of these people who want to enslave me and take my land? How do we pay you this tax? Say, oh, glad you asked. We're looking for people to dig mines for us. We're looking for people to do XYZ for the British government, for the British colonial authority. So work for us, dig the mines, we'll pay you a weekly wage, a daily wage in British pounds, and at the end of the year, you can pay your taxes to us. Makes perfect sense. So now you're going to have a core group of the population, not everybody working, but a core group of the population saying, okay, we're going to dig the mines, we're going to do this work. We get paid in British pounds, and at the end of the year, say April 15th or something like that, you pay your taxes to the British authority. Now think of this logic. Let's say the British authority spent 100 million pounds in that society in year one, the very first year. So there's 100 million pounds in circulation in the economy. What's the maximum that they can collect on April 15th? 100, right? Million. There's no way they can collect 101, right, in that closed economy example. What if the tax rate is 100% so that the British authority can balance its budget and not have a deficit? What are they going to have? They're going to have a rebellion. People worked hard the entire year and the British government took all their money and left them with nothing, starving, right? So what's the reasonable tax rate that the British authority, the French authority used during colonial times? Well, maybe 15%, 20%, whatever you think is reasonable, but wouldn't start a rebellion against the British authority because you want to continue the colonial extraction. So what happens if the British authority only taxes 30 million and they spent 100? They have a deficit of 70 million pounds. Where is that money? Does it disappear? It's somewhere in the economy, in the private sector, because people are using it in private transactions now. Your money dominates the new economy. The old money doesn't exist anymore because nobody cares for it. So the reason you impose a tax is to enforce the demand for your currency and give you that sovereign power that allows you now to marshal the resources that you need to dig the mines, to build the bridges, to do whatever the authority decides. Now, the authority can be abusive, dictatorial, colonial, and it could be fair, it could be just, it could have a public purpose to build a better infrastructure for society, to fund schools and hospitals and so on. So the challenge for the British authority was not finding the money. They create the money. The challenge was to find the skilled people to do the things that they wanted. And the skilled people you can train, the infrastructure you can build. That's the sovereign power of the government. And we want it to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a corrupt and abusive government that wastes resources, starts wars, and abuses the most vulnerable in society, neglects the needs of the poor, the needs of the ill, and so on. That's the logic. So what happens if that British authority uses the same the next year and the next year and the next year and the next year? You have deficit after deficit after deficit. It adds up to a large number after 100 years. That large number, we call it the national debt, right? That's what the national debt is, the summation of all the previous deficits. Now, after 100 years of deficit after deficit after deficit, can we have a single year of a surplus for the British government where they spend 75 and they tax 85? Sure, they can, because they're taxing out of all the previous savings that consumers in the private sector have accumulated worth of 100 years worth of government deficit. Because in that first year, the deficit for the British authority, that 70 million pound, is exactly equal to the penny of the surplus that the private sector has accumulated in wealth. Now, that wealth could be unequal. Maybe it was just two people who had most of that wealth. So then we should have distribution policies so that when we spend the right way to distribute income equally, not to have high concentration of wealth and power to few individuals who are friends of the British governor or something like that. So, but literally, the deficit that the government injects into the economy is exactly equal to the surplus that all of us users of that currency have collectively. And we want to have that surplus to be evenly distributed, not to be abusive and exclusive and so on.
Yes.
So that's really why
it's a teeter-totter.
Exactly.
It's a teeter-totter that every dollar that the government collects, every dollar that is federal government deficit is a dollar that is being used in the economy, and every dollar that the federal government has in surplus is a dollar that is not being used in the economy. It's like those they teeter-totter back and forth.
Sure. And just to illustrate a little bit more so that people don't think that, what we're describing is everybody working for the government digging mines. Let's say I'm a fisherman in that colonial authority, and I don't really like digging mines, and I just like to continue doing what I'm doing, right? But I still owe taxes to the British authority at the end of the year. So now, as soon as the tax is imposed, I bring my fish to the market and I say, well, I'm not going to accept the old money because I need pounds to pay my taxes. So I only accept pounds from now on. So all of a sudden, you converted the entire economy into a British-controlled monetary system where the British pound is now the currency. Now, to make it more realistic, fast forward a few decades, let's say we have now banks in the system, right? Because we don't want the government to micromanage the entire economy and employ everybody and to give loans to everybody. That's not the responsibility of government. So what governments did, including the US government, is what we've delegated some of that money creation authority to key institutions. We call them banks, and we give them a banking license with the responsibility to serve the public purpose, to help people buy homes or build businesses or whatever it is, build the railroads and so on. So we give them an exclusive privilege to actually create money into existence when they lend money. So when you and I go to a bank and buy a house or buy a car, they make you sign a whole bunch of papers. Sign here, initial here, sign here, initially. One of those documents, if you pay attention, is called the promissory note. It's the most important document you sign. And that promissory note is essentially, literally it says, I promise to pay you back $200,000, right? And if I don't pay you back, the bank can take that document to court and the federal government will enforce it and will go after you to make you pay ultimately, or to take your house and sell it and hopefully it's still worth $200,000 or maybe more, right? Not underwater mortgage. So that promissory note, once you sign it, the bank takes that document and it becomes an asset that they actually have from an accounting perspective. If you know accounting, you have assets and liabilities. That promissory note worth $200,000 is now an asset that they own, right? Because they can collect on it. And then the liability side of the bank is literally they give me $200,000 in my bank account that I can go ahead and spend to buy a house. So that's a liability for them because that's money that's going to be pulled out of the bank. So an asset and a liability was created simultaneously out of thin air, just because we have a legal system that says it's okay, it's safe to do that. Because this person you're lending money to is responsible, has a job, will pay you back. And the government is good for it. The government is going to back you up in court, right? So what is stopping the bank from lending me $2 million to buy a fancier house? Well, my productive capacity. Am I good for $2 million? Not even close, right? But if I had that wealth and that job that paid me massive bonuses on Wall Street, I go to the bank, the same loan application, they look at my income, they look at my job and everything and say, oh, it looks like you're good for a $2 million home. So all of a sudden, that same promissory note has a whole bunch of zeros on it. So now their asset went up by $2 million. My bank account went up by $2 million. Now I can buy the house. So what is limiting how much the bank can issue is the real productive capacity of the economy. Can we actually handle that additional money creation that we've delegated to banks, right? So that's why a lot of people today say, well, all of it is debt and debt and debt because banks are lending. But yeah, that's why we have regulations. We regulate banks and we give them a license to make sure that they're actually doing their job, not handing out loans to anybody without actually checking if there's a productive capacity in the economy to handle it. So that's what we're saying. We have all of this potential increase in spending that we're not tapping into.
Yeah.
I will tell you, we have kept you 11 minutes longer than promised, but you have made my brain feel better. So if that was worth 11 minutes in your asset on your deficit side, it became an asset for my brain. So thank you so much. We didn't even get into all of which we will do next time. This will be last time you were on, this time. These are the primers. We'll push this to people so they can sort of get it. But until you get this notion, it's hard for people to understand.
It's a tough pill to swallow. When you read Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, in the first few pages, she talks about her own journey as an economist, trained in the traditional way that all of us were brought up. It was a long struggle of escape, trying to escape the old ideas and really make sense of this new way of looking at the economy. And you just keep reading and keep exploring, keep looking at legal documents and how this functions, and you realize we've been duped.
Well, one of the things I do want to talk about at some point is why people who know this system are duping. Why is duping happening? It's hard for me to quite understand that, but we can't get into that quite today. But that'll keep people coming back. So thank you so much. You're a master teacher. I'm seeing people in the comments that are saying the same kind of relief because these are complex issues that feels like are often kept away. And maybe it's your sensitivity as a college professor that your job is to help people grasp these issues, but that has happened today. So thank you. Thank you so much. Hey, and stick with us. We come back every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So, and if this was worth a lot to you, go over to Vote Common Good, move some of your assets into the liability category and make a contribution, and we will send a nice gift to Fadhel for helping all of us out. But thanks for being a part of the Vote Common Good community here online with the daily podcast, and we will see you on Monday.